Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Today we're talking to Matt Pruitt. He has been actively pursuing a resolution to the Bigfoot or Sasquatch conundrum for over 15 years. He's an avid field researcher, public speaker, and has appeared on various media outlets and platforms to discuss the mystery ape phenomenon. Matt is a member of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy and co-produces and co-hosts their official podcast, Apes Among Us. How are you doing today, Matt?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Eric.
Thanks for joining me. So how did you get started in being interested in Bigfoot and researching?
Well, like many people, I had an encounter, an experience when I was younger. And, we didn't see the things. We basically were confronted by these unseen things in this thick forest at night in Northeast Georgia, where I grew up in the Southern Appalachians there. And the most consistent kind of testimonies with the experience that I had were related to the Sasquatch phenomenon. So that was what initially spurred my interest into looking into it. So in the beginning, it was basically aggregating eyewitness reports from the area that I grew up, and then finding a lot of historical records and data that predated the year 1900, and seeing time and time again these kind of references to this sort of animal having persisted in the Southern Appalachians for as far back as you could look in history, and especially in terms of like the printed word and print media. And so I started in earnest there, and then started expanding out to different parts of the country. And so that's been I really started aggregating that information in about 2002. And then by 2004, I was getting involved in field research. And within a couple of years, I was traveling around the country. I've lived all over the country pursuing these things, and continue to do so to this day.
Have you ever had any personal experiences?
Well, I've had a number of experiences over the years in a lot of different places, from, again, the Southern Appalachians to the U.S. interior highlands, being kind of like the Ouachitas and Ozarks of Oklahoma, Arkansas. I lived in the Pacific Northwest for 3 years and had a number of experiences there. So yes, over the years, I've had a handful of encounters, but it's taken, hundreds and hundreds of days and nights in the field pursuing it to have accumulated those experiences. But I still haven't had, a very clear visual observation. So I certainly can't say that I've seen one of these animals.
What do people typically report in the Southern Appalachian Mountains?
Well, it's consistent with the reports from around the continent. That as far back as you can look, especially again if we look at, let's say, the printed word. Obviously Native American communities, and predominantly where I grew up would be the Cherokee tribe, have these representative characters in their oral traditions, or in their I guess you could call it mythology, that are consistent with these things. But starting with like the advent of the printed word, which first came in the form of these circulars that would be generated and passed around between various industry camps, like the logging industry, the mining industry, etc. People have been describing these spontaneous and brief observations of encounters with these large bipedal hair-covered animals that fit the description of apes. If you look at the consistencies and commonalities of those reports, they're describing these very large, anywhere from 7 to 8.5 foot tall ape-like animals, no tails, no claws, no snouts or muzzles or that sort of thing. So the descriptions seem to approximate some form of ape, and that again has been reported for as long as there's been the printed word in the Southern Appalachians and most of the country, in the right habitats, that is. I think a lot of people think that it's a phenomenon that's relegated to the Pacific Northwest. That's where the first research was really done. And so the first people that were aggregating and disseminating information were in the Northwest, but the history goes back much further in the East, and especially the Southern Appalachians. But really, that's just a consequence of the fact that those areas were settled first.
With a concentration in the Southern Appalachian, do you think that it's because that's such an expansive forest and it's not really populated that there hasn't been more sightings or more evidence?
Well, there's a number of sightings. I mean, again, it'd be hard to tell exactly how many there are in number, because, not all observations get reported. And then of observations that are made and, told to people, not all of those end up being accessible to the public via, some Bigfoot investigator who takes that report and prints it up somehow, whether that's in a book or in the local media or on some Bigfoot website or something of that nature. But of the sightings that I'm aware of personally, I mean, there's a tremendous amount, a great many. And it is a fantastic and viable habitat. I mean, the Southern Appalachians constitutes the second richest temperate forested zone on the planet. The only more biodiverse and rich area in that temperate forest category is actually in central China. So it's an incredibly rich environment that supports a host of flora and fauna, a massive population of black bears, which are other very large omnivorous mammals that to some degree would be analogous to these things. So there are a number of sightings. It's just a great deal of those have never been aggregated and published. I mean, I'd say of the witnesses that I've interviewed, all over the country, I've interviewed well over 1,500 witnesses at this point, but the vast majority of those did not want their stories disseminated in any way. So again, to have a Sasquatch report, you have to have two factors. You have to have a Sasquatch and a human observer. So there's a lot of places, let's say in the Southern Appalachians, that constitute viable habitat that just don't have an influx of human observers. There's just not a lot of people frequenting these areas. Of those who are, the majority of those aren't really inviting some outside element to come in to discuss that particular observation. This has been relegated to the fringe and the taboo for so long that I think, especially like what I've seen in some of these Southern Appalachian communities, is that the smaller a community, the tighter knit it is, the more there is a reputational risk to discussing something that isn't readily accepted. So anything that falls into that category of like the fringe or the taboo, people usually have there's like a disincentive to discuss that because, again, in a small community, everyone knows everyone, so you have more to risk reputationally. So you find that some of these places that generate reports have everything to do with the human activity and the human influence. So places that see an influx of outsiders, let's say tourist areas where people who don't have that kind of like local investment, reputational investment in those communities, they might be a little bit more prone to talk about things in a way that make those reports make their way out into the public sphere. But certainly there's no shortage of witnesses. And, I was very fortunate having grown up where I did and having, the connection to people that I grew up with and then family connections, that I was able to get a lot of reports simply by virtue that people knew that I took it seriously, that I would listen to these people intently, and that, the confidentiality was paramount. And so I wasn't going to disseminate those things. So I think there are probably a lot more observations of these things than we'll ever know about, or at least potentially post official recognition or discovery, we might find out about a lot more.
With the mainstream, with so many ghost shows and stuff, that haunting type stuff has come to the forefront of the conversation in the general population. I think now people believe more in ghosts than they ever have, or they're just out with it and saying that they do. What do you think it's going to take with the Bigfoot community and the Sasquatch community for it to be mainstream like that?
Well, it's fairly mainstream in the American consciousness. I mean, everyone knows what a Bigfoot is. You know what I mean? Like if you were to ask, a random sampling of the American public, everyone sees that kind of iconic image of what a Sasquatch is supposed to be, and whether or not they accept that there's a real biological species that's at the heart of the Sasquatch mythology, like a biological ape in the core of the Sasquatch mythology. At least people know that, well, some people take these claims seriously, and that claims do exist where people have claimed to spontaneously encounter these animals. So that's always been a big part of the mainstream, really starting in the late 1950s when the word Bigfoot was coined in Northern California and kind of hit the AP wire and spread across America. And that's kind of the birth of the, Bigfoot as part of the American social consciousness. And then it's only grown since then. I mean, there was a Animal Planet TV series called Finding Bigfoot that did extremely well, and that generated, a lot of further interest. And, it has some negative side effects too, wherein, these people have these experiences, many of which are ambiguous, and then they attribute these ambiguous experiences to Sasquatches. So there's a little bit more, or I'd say a little bit, it's probably a lot more noise in the noise to signal ratio at this point in terms of separating out what constitutes very reliable, credible data, observational encounter testimonial data. So there are some drawbacks to, these kind of concepts becoming more and more mainstream and people becoming more and more aware of them, and then becoming essentially like hyper vigilant. I think shows like that cause people to go back out in the natural world with this sort of vigilance where, uh, for people who are a bit too optimistic or maybe possessed a bit by wishful thinking, now every broken twig in the forest is indicative of the passing of a Sasquatch, and every divot in the ground is a Sasquatch track, and every unidentified animal sound in the night was being generated by a Sasquatch, and that's just simply not the case. So I think what it will eventually take will be some sort of a specimen, whether that's one that's discovered that's naturally deceased, or whether a hunter procures one, or one is struck and hit by a vehicle, that will then encourage qualified scientists to get involved and to study these particular animals and disseminate more reliable information that people then can then use as this kind of like criteria to gauge against their own experiences before the reality, the biological reality, becomes mainstream. But right now the mythology is much more mainstream than the biological reality, because if you're looking at this, I mean, I guess the way that I frame it with a lot of people is, well, we're talking about this as a conundrum. That's why I use that particular word so often. There's this problem here. We have this phenomenon that is comprised of claims, testimonial claims, and these objects, I guess you could call them, that constitute evidence or suggestive evidence. Footprints, hair samples, multimedia evidence, photos, video, audio, etc. That kind of constitutes this phenomenon. And so I don't think anyone could responsibly say that the phenomenon doesn't exist. The question is, the conundrum that's posed by it is, what is responsible for this phenomenon? You could boil that down to one of two reasons. Either it's entirely the production of the human mind, whether both voluntary, as in, lying or fabricating, or involuntary, as in some, manifestation of like the collective unconscious or something of that nature, or there is a real biological species at the core of it, that there are real animals that people are seeing that are responsible for this mythology or this legend. And so that hypothesis as such is still unverified. Obviously, I'm a proponent of the hypothesis that no, there is a species of ape, of hominoid, that's at the core of this, but that's so far unverified. But that's what it would take in order to get, if that hypothesis bears to be true, to get that into the mainstream, to kind of supplant the mythological concept or the spooky campfire creature concept.
Throughout the world, every day there are new species discovered, and there's rediscovery of animals that they, especially some large size mammals that they believe, were extinct many years ago. I think, that we definitely could find a body at some point in time, but because of these remote locations, it makes it a lot harder with scavengers and that type of stuff. And then maybe, one day science will take it seriously. What kind of evidence have you personally collected throughout your research?
Well, I've encountered tracks, certainly nothing of the caliber of some of the best tracks that have ever been documented. And that's early on, I kind of decided to build an intimate familiarity with the best evidence that's ever been gathered thus far collectively across the continent, and the evaluation and analysis of that evidence, and then realize that, well, at this point in time, again, that hypothesis is still unverified, and that's based on the cumulative weight or strength of the existing evidence. And so it became apparent to me early on, well, if I don't have something that is far superior to that, or surpasses that either in quality and quantity, then there's no point in really trying to present it and then defend it. So I'm still in a rigorous pursuit of better evidence. But again, I've had experiences that were consistent with the phenomena. I've recorded vocalizations that were consistent with other purported Sasquatch vocalizations that don't correlate with any other North American mammal, or mammals on other continents for that matter, that certainly weren't fabricated or synthesized or mechanical. But again, I think most people that I've seen in the history of this field very often neglect that step of developing this very strong familiarity with the best evidence collected thus far, and then using that as sort of a bar, setting a standard and saying, well, if it's not up to this particular standard, then, expecting it to have any more of an impact than better evidence is again a bit of like wishful thinking and maybe a bit naive. So I'm still pursuing that, but at this point in time, after all these years, I certainly don't have any tracks that are better in clarity than some of the best examples from, let's say, like the Grace Harbor County tracks from 1982, or various other trackways that have been documented.
For people who would say, you're full of it, they don't believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch, they know the lore, but What would you say to those people to try to get them to open their mind to something like that existing?
To really be able to look at a set of data or, any sort of like complex phenomenon, you really have to arm yourself with the relevant information and really, again, develop an intimate familiarity with that information. Otherwise, I've said it a million times, and it's kind of paraphrasing other thinkers, but everyone's entitled to their opinion. But if your opinion is not based on a familiarity with all of the relevant data, then your opinion's essentially worthless. And this subject is so very complex, and it's composed of a host of subcomponents that require a lot of research and study and knowledge and understanding. So I think most people's concept of the Bigfoot phenomena or the Sasquatch phenomenon is like if you took something highly complicated, let's say like a nuclear submarine or something like that, you tried to explain what that was to a layperson and then have that person, draw a picture of it and then hand it to someone else. And they're looking at this picture, a crudely drawn crayon picture from a layperson that's trying to explain something as complicated as a nuclear submarine. Obviously their understanding of it is going to be pretty flawed. If they said, oh, there's no way a machine like that could ever work, well, they'd be wrong. But what they're seeing is this really low resolution version of it. And this subject is very much that way. Is that requires a lot of understanding about physical or biological anthropology, paleoanthropology, the history of human evolution and pre-human ancestors, the extant or living, surviving great apes, etc., and a host of other disciplines like phenomenology, for example, which we can get into because I think that's where there are some parallels with other topics that are relegated to that, the fringe, the paranormal, the taboo, etc. So my starting point with people say, well, let me provide you with some information to help you build this lens to look through and then see the subject in a certain light, because most people are dismissive of it due to the lack of knowledge, their lack of familiarity. So we know, from the fossil record that there was a clade, a sister clade to the orangutan that lived in Asia for a very long time. We're aware of two genera within that clade. Giganopithecus, which originally was under this genus called Giganopithecus, but it was the older of these two genera. So there's Giganopithecus giganteus, which is a genus and a species, and then more recently Giganopithecus blacki. Now these were the largest apes known to man, or at least Giganopithecus blacki was. Giganopithecus was roughly the size of the mountain gorilla. These apes lived from about 8.5 million years ago till roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago in Asia. So they were contemporaneous with our genus and contemporaneous even with very early Homo sapiens. Now, these animals had a very long tenure and they had a massive geographic distribution, with Giganopithecus occurring in Pakistan on the Patwar Plateau and then over into what is now China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, etc. So a very long tenure and a very massive geographic distribution, and were contemporaneous with the genus Homo. So we lived alongside these big, massive apes, with Giganopithecus blacki, again, estimated in that 8-foot range in terms of height. Now, we don't know a tremendous amount about how they were built because there are no postcranial remains of these animals, but it's very likely that they were upright. There's about a 50-50 chance, or potentially a better than a 50-50 chance, that they were bipedal, that they walked habitually upright. Now, there's a massive interflow of animals that came into North America from Asia, which also includes Homo sapiens. The peopling of the Americas occurred via Beringia, across, the Bering Land Bridge, which at the appropriate times was just one big contiguous unbroken forested habitat. And so a whole host of animals made their way into this continent from Asia. So I think the most parsimonious solution for the Sasquatch phenomenon, if there is indeed a real animal species, is that it is either some surviving species within one of those two genera or some other genus that was produced by that clade. Again, a clade will produce a radiation of genera, and each genus will produce a radiation of species. And thus far, we're only aware of two from this very long tenure of time. And again, they were closely related to the orangutan, or most closely related to the orangutan line, having diverged from a common ancestor about 10 to 12 million years ago. Now, the interesting thing with the Sasquatch information is that, again, as soon as print media in the written word is being generated in America, people are describing these things. And this is prior to our discovery of some of the most relevant extant great apes, like the mountain gorilla. So there are these behavioral these ecological and these morphological or physiological consistencies in the Sasquatch data that are later borne out by our understanding of great apes. So, in other words, they're predicting norms, they're predicting trends and truths that are true of the ape world that we weren't aware of yet as humans or as Western civilization. Giganopithecus fossils weren't discovered until 1924. And so it's interesting to me that you have all this historical data that is totally accurate and predictive and anticipates future discoveries. So I would think on the flip side, well, if they're, quote unquote, if they're not real, then we would have to explain, how it is that if this set of information was entirely the product of the imagination or entirely fabricated, if it's people lying, how is it, what are the odds that they would generate all these concepts that later bore out to be true? Why didn't people see other sorts of mystery animals in North America? Or even, using Giganopithecus as a model, there are people who postulate these things like, well, we know those things used to exist, so it might be the case that humans had such frightening interactions with them in Asia that there's this vestigial genetic memory, and that's what people are seeing, which I always thought was funny because it wasn't like they were preying on humans. There's plenty of things that preyed on us, that would have had a much more traumatic impact on the collective human psyche, and yet people don't claim to see saber-toothed cats in North America or the American lion or short-faced bears, or this host of other animals that we had to contend with. It's only this one particular form, this large, upright, ape-like form. So I think the more that people inform themselves with that, the more these questions get harder to dismiss. The more you see those consistencies in the historical record, you think, well, how could that be that they accurately describe these certain, for example, the appearance of kind of a sloped or peaked head, which is indicative of a sagittal crest, which is an ape feature that we hadn't discovered yet. We hadn't found, fossil hominoids that displayed that feature. We hadn't officially discovered the mountain gorilla, and yet people in the Appalachian are describing that feature. Now, of all the things, if you were creating a fictitious monster, you just look at popular fiction and you see the kind of things that we generate with our imaginations, cyclops or massive recurved claws or big bat wings or blood dripping fangs, but that stuff's absent. It's not present in the Sasquatch data. They're describing these quite normal apes, including features that we know to be actual morphological features of large apes, but prior to that discovery. And so I think most people, that might be a long-winded answer to your question, but I think most people who dismiss it are doing so from a point of having this kind of like low-level understanding and not understanding how complex it is. Very often people say to me, well, I'm skeptical. I think it's all bogus. And I'll say, well, I'm skeptical too, but what I'm skeptical of is, anyone who tries to reduce a complex phenomenon down to a single explanatory mechanism, because this thing's highly complex. And in the canon of data, yes, some of those testimonies, let's say, are misidentifications. Some of them are misremembered. Some of them are probably lies. Some of them are honest and truthful. I mean, you can't apply any one explanation to something as complex as this.
Even here recently, like in Middle Tennessee, the TWRA, there were sightings of mountain lions, and the TWRA kept saying there's no mountain lions in Middle Tennessee, none, until they got trail cam footage. And then they had to finally come out and say, oh, there are mountain lions in Middle Tennessee, even though we're not, necessarily a mountainous region. There's not been any evidence of a giant ape in North America. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Oh, certainly. Well, there's definitely evidence. The question is, what is it evidence of? When you're talking about the very best tracks, for example, I mean, they're only superficially human-like. I think a lot of people have this idea that Sasquatch tracks are these big, giant human tracks. They're superficially human-like in terms of, they're an elongated foot with 5 digits, one of which is larger than the other 4. But there's morphology and kind of a functional morphology that you can infer from these tracks that is consistent with pre-human hominoids, specifically with certain elements that are consistent with Australopithecine. Interestingly, once again, the Sasquatch tracks that show this feature predate the discovery of Australopithecus and predate the discovery of fossilized trackways of Australopithecine. So you could look at one level of analysis and say, okay, well, some of this stuff might be misidentification, which is just, an honest mistake. It's like a faux pas. Someone saw a moose or a bear at a distance, and their mind kind of filled in the blanks and they assumed it was something other than those animals. Or they found registered bear prints where the forepaws and the hind paws of a bear in their step sequence overlapped each other, and so it gave the superficial impression of a large track, a single large track. So if you throw all of those out and you're looking at just the most clear, detailed ones, you only have two options. Either a real animal made those, or they were fabricated by a human. There's no in between. And you could say that of the best evidence, period, even outside of physical evidence, the best eyewitness testimony. Again, you have this host of reports that could easily be misidentifications, but then you have a few where you have someone who's essentially of unimpeachable character that would be trusted, in all other aspects of their lives, that say they saw something at, 30 feet away in broad daylight, unobstructed, and saw it from head to toe and describe essentially a Sasquatch. Either they saw that real animal or they didn't, because you're not going to mistake a bear for something like that. And you're not going to mistake a moose or an elk for something like that. And so it really boils down to looking at these particular elements and then deciding, well, if we eliminate the ape hypothesis and there's only this human, the production of the human mind or the human skill set hypothesis in terms of tracks, then you have to explain, well, what are the odds that they would include this particular feature of these footprints that would later bear out to be one of the most crucial components of the history of bipedal locomotion. But they got this right decades before any of those things were even discovered or later analyzed and recognized. And so, again, as bizarre as it might sound, the more parsimonious, the simpler solution is like, well, no, there really is this animal that is leaving this trace that people are encountering. And sometimes people spontaneously encounter these animals. They see them, they hear them, etc. And that gives rise in this time of pre-discovery to this mythology of the Sasquatch. But I do think, to your point, no one should have been surprised when the TWRA officially recognizes the return of mountain lions to Middle Tennessee. Because first of all, people have seen them forever. Historically, they used to be here before they were extirpated. And so you could look back retroactively and see, oh yeah, there's this unbroken timeline of observations, or at least of testimonies. I think the same thing will be true here. The analogy I use, as silly as it might be, I know we've all seen The Sixth Sense, so I have to say sorry to your listeners. If you haven't seen The Sixth Sense, there's going to be a big spoiler alert. But, you watch this film and you're seeing a certain kind of movie until the end when you realize that Bruce Willis's character has been dead the whole time. And you can never watch that same film again. Every time you watch it, you are seeing it with that knowledge in mind, and then you pick up all these clues. I think discovery, especially in terms of things like this, will happen quite the same way, is that once these things are officially discovered, everyone will look back and go, oh yeah, it was there all along. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of sightings and hundreds of tracks that have been photographed. And then, a smaller subset of still hundreds of tracks that have been cast. And there have been hair samples collected that are consistent with each other, that have primate morphological characteristics and yet don't correlate with any of the known primates. These vocalization recordings, these bits of footage, photographs, on and on and on. So I think in retrospect, it will be blatantly obvious that we kind of discovered these things as a society a long time ago, but we had not yet accepted it or recognized it. We rely so much on our institutions. So you could say, well, have they been discovered? And I would say, like, yeah, I've talked to a lot of individuals who've discovered them, much to their chagrin. They weren't quite happy about those spontaneous encounters because they're typically quite frightening. Even though the animals don't seem to be that aggressive, but it's just a frightening experience to encounter something unknown, and especially something of that size, and not have any, feedback about what to do in those situations. And so there's, again, thousands or tens of thousands of people who have, quote unquote, discovered these things, but our institutions have not formally made or supported such a discovery. So on one hand, we're pretty far along that discovery process. And on the other hand, we're right where we started, in the 1950s when this hit the American consciousness, both of those kind of simultaneously.
So throughout all your research and all the years that you've been investigating this, there are many reports of, you have the Yeti, you got Sasquatch, you got a skunk ape, many different names all over the world. Do you think that that's because they're different species of the same hominids that have just evolved to their environment?
Well, if you're talking about, let's start with just North America. So in the beginning, there was no single term. There was no like collective nomenclature to house all of these testimonies or encounters or claims under. And so, depending on where you were in the continent, you would have these different regional terms. So, again, if you're looking back all the way to Native American peoples or First Nations peoples in Canada, they had names for animals that fit the description of Sasquatch. And, those names vary from tribe to tribe, obviously, these various geographic locations. And then with the advent, again, the first settlers and the advent of print media, there's a host of different terms. And so in the South, one of the things that gets used a lot is booger, which is just a Southern, Appalachian derivative of boogie, like the boogeyman. So they call them mountain boogers or wood boogers or woolly boogers was a common term. Other parts of the country, they call them devils, whereas forest devils, mountain devils, a whole host of terms. Now, post-discovery of the mountain gorilla, which was officially discovered by Western science in 1902, and then later that information gets disseminated throughout America, throughout print media. Then you start having that nomenclature appear, where people saw this thing that looked very much like a gorilla because that was the closest analog. So in the beginning, they called them, devils or demon or wild men or boogeymen, because the closest analog is some sort of man-like animal, because they're very large and they walk on two legs and they've got forward-facing eyes. And so there's something shared between the human physiology and ape physiology. But then later, as you have, the emergence of the gorilla into the consciousness, people start using that as a reference. So it's hard to aggregate all that stuff because they're all using these different terms. And then in the 1920s, there was a teacher in British Columbia, J.W. Burns, who anglicized a First Nations word and changed it to Sasquatch. And he was the first person to start aggregating a lot of different Sasquatch sighting reports as well as traditional knowledge and disseminating that, publishing that in various newspaper articles and magazine articles, et cetera. And so that became kind of the first catch-all term, whereas people realized, oh, these other things that people see are described identically physically, and they all fit under this rubric of the Sasquatch. And then in 1958, tracks are discovered in Northern California, and they called that particular individual Sasquatch Bigfoot. It's kind of like a nickname for this one individual. And then that kind of became the new nomenclature for the whole phenomenon or the whole, purported species, et cetera. So a lot of the North American name differences are clearly describing the same thing. Now, if you look at on a global scale, there are various forms that appear time and time again in this really interesting distribution. So of the large Sasquatch-like form, or the wood ape-like forms, the nomenclature our organization uses, again, this kind of 7 to 8 foot tall, massive, very broad-shouldered, heavy bipedal ape, there is this distribution that's very similar to the range of Giganopithecine, or at least of that clade, whereas people see similar animals or claim to see similar animals in China that they call the Yeren, in Bhutan. As you go down through like the Johor Peninsula of Malaysia, you have the orang mawas, and then down all the way to Australia, essentially what they call the Yowie. These all fit the same physical descriptions. They display a lot of the same behaviors in the same context. So I don't think it's irresponsible, if again all these animals bear out to be real, that they would be at least within the same genus, if not extremely closely related, perhaps subspecies. Then you have other parts of the world where there are other mystery hominoids. So, for example, when you go into Mongolia and Russia and some of these areas, there's a more man-like form, even down into Pakistan, the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, what's called the Barmanu, the Almas, the Almasti. These are about 5 to 6 feet tall, more gracile, not quite as robust, that are much more in keeping with other closer human ancestors, or even human relatives like the Neanderthals or potentially the Denisovans. So you get into really tropical areas like Indonesia, Sumatra. There are these small diminutive ape forms that they call the orang pendek, which are like about 3 to 4 feet tall at their adult height. These very, very small hominids, the same part of the world that, within the last, I think, 10, 15 years, Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit fossil was found. So now we know that animals like this did exist there. So there are mystery ape sightings from various places in the world. Interestingly, they're absent in other areas. Like, for example, if we go back to this idea of it being the involuntary production of the human mind, which is an argument I hear from time to time. People say, oh, well, there's just something about our connection with nature that, we manifest these sightings. Well, really, then why don't people do it in Scandinavia or in the Alps or There's these types of things aren't recorded in the forested mountains of Korea. There's various parts of the world where the habitat is right. The Carpathians, for example, and yet there are no stories of mystery apes. It's really this kind of circum-Pacific distribution primarily, which again it correlates with the radiation of Giganopithecine, and then there's a little bit of that in Africa, especially in South Africa, there in the Afro-montane forests. There's a fantastic researcher who was a lion and elephant researcher named Gareth Patterson, who had a series of sightings over about a 20-year period of a very Sasquatch-like mystery hominoid down there that we've interviewed on our podcast on Apes Among Us, but he wrote a fantastic book about it. So again, there is this worldwide mystery ape phenomenon, but you certainly couldn't classify all those into being like the same type of thing. There seem to be a few different distinct categories or subtypes, I guess you could say, which was first proposed by Ivan Sanderson in the early 60s. But these different names mostly have to do, especially in North America, with just regional names and before information could be disseminated, prior to the radio, the television, the internet, etc.
So a lot of the reports, like a majority of them, come from these unpopulated areas like the Appalachian Mountains and the Pacific Northwest. Have you gotten any firsthand accounts from like Middle Tennessee, some of the more populated areas?
Well, it's interesting. Like, I've lived here in Middle Tennessee now for about 6 years, and there are some older reports, but I've not seen anything recent or spoken to any recent, and by recent I mean like the last 20 years, witnesses. It seems like it's mostly restricted to the Southern Appalachians of East Tennessee and then portions of the Cumberland Plateau, which are technically part of the Appalachian uplift. But so there's some excellent habitat along the Cumberland Plateau as well. But I think the bulk of those in this part of the country would be in the Southern Appalachians. But certainly there are older reports. I mean, there was a very famous flap of sightings in Southern Tennessee around Flintville that made the local news, and I think some of them even made national news stories because some of them were fairly dramatic. But those kind of things happen from time to time, where it seems like one particular individual, whether that's a transient male or some kind of rogue male individual, leaves a larger, more unbroken habitat in search of either more resources or its own habitat, and in that process comes close to people as it's transitioning from one area to the other. You see that very often in the Sasquatch data set. Now we know too that the discovery of the mountain gorilla was predicated on those same things, whereas lone males, transient males who were striking out to find their own territories, would very often come back to areas from their youth, and those areas were now being occupied by logging camps or mining camps or something like that. So some of the first impressions of mountain gorillas were that they were solitary individuals who roamed. They didn't understand that they lived in these large family units, because the only time people would see them is when these lone individuals would come to the fringes of human habitation. And again, the Sasquatch information kind of mirrors that, although it predates it. It's older than it. But so there are reports in Middle Tennessee historically, but I'm not aware of any current reports. Now, I stopped really investigating witness reports in about 2013. I did that for a very long time, but I've just been so focused on developing my own study areas, and then obviously the primary study site of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. I spend a lot of time there each year, and so I no longer kind of pursue that quest of chasing the smoke on the horizon of people citing reports or something of that nature. But to answer your question, no, I don't really. It'd be hard to see that might be the case, just because it's a very different kind of habitat than other parts of the country where these things seem to occur. But I wouldn't totally write it off, and I think maybe some of that historical information has a lot of merit that could be explained by this concept of transient males or lone individuals striking out and moving through an area. Because again, those flaps you have multiple witnesses over a short span of time, like maybe a couple of weeks, and then it just dries up. There's no more sightings, no more reports, as if the thing has just moved on. And so those kind of constitute that category of case are kind of the primary ones that I'm aware of in the history of Middle Tennessee, for example.
And you kind of touched on the investigative area of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. That's known as Area X.
That's correct.
And what kind of stuff are y'all doing out there? What kind of equipment have y'all got out in that area?
Well, they've been working in that area off and on for about 20 years. And then for the last 10 years, they've been doing these extended summer operations where we keep the site occupied for weeks at a time on end. So this year is my 4th year with the organization, and we have 15 weeks scheduled for this year to keep the site occupied. So we've tried a host of things in the past. Right now, what we currently have in place that we're excited about is a new sort of take on the game camera approach, which thus far has typically failed in procuring any images of Sasquatches. I think a lot of that has to do with the detectability of game cameras via the infrared flash. Infrared is, that nomenclature just refers to being below the visible spectrum of light for human perception. Most animals that operate at night can see into the IR or the near IR range. Bears, bobcats, cougars, raccoons, deer, on and on and on. A whole host of animals can see those things, coyotes. And so we're trying an approach this year where we have an array of cameras that are stretched across this choke point within the valley floor. It's kind of a natural bottleneck that wildlife has to pass through because the slopes are steep on either side, kind of using the topography to our advantage. So we have this array of cameras that all have these overlapping fields of view, so that if you were to pass through at any point, you wouldn't just be photographed by one camera, you'd be photographed by a minimum of 3 at a time, and in some cases, maybe as many as 5. And they're set to rapid fire, so as soon as they trigger, they'll immediately fire 8 photographs, whether or not the thing stays in the frame. And then these are laid out in these kind of clusters, these clusters that have these overlapping fields of view, and then you kind of line the clusters up sequentially across the valley floor. And in the center of every cluster, there are 2 cameras in polar opposite directions that shoot video. So we're pretty optimistic about that. We use a lot of thermal imaging technology at night. We use them in the daytime too, but obviously they're more effective at night. We've had these autonomous recording units that will record about 6 months of raw audio at a time. They're the same units that are used by institutions like Cornell to do surveys of wildlife, or for bird sounds in their ornithology school, et cetera. So we've got a host of different technologies in play at this time, but more than anything, the most important component is just boots on the ground. And we're just conducting an observational field study, and that requires a lot of manpower and a lot of man hours. And so it's this Herculean effort to pull off every year to keep a remote site occupied without any interruptions for 15 weeks straight. As you can imagine, it's a lot of coordinating people's schedules and vacation time, because we all have day jobs and we all have bills and obligations and we all work. But for anyone who's interested in a deeper dive on that, at our website, woodape.org, there's this document called the Ouachita Project Monograph, which goes into great detail about the first several years of these field operations. There's another document there, a paper published about some interesting radio tag data where we think we might have tagged one of these animals and followed its movements for about 9 or 10 months. And then we have our podcast too, Apes Among Us, where we discuss a lot of these things in depth. And we release that about once a month or so.
And what else do you have coming up for your research in Southern Appalachian?
Well, I'm out in the field as much as I can be throughout the year. There's a few sites that I've really poured a lot of energy and time and blood, sweat, and tears into, again, since about 2004. So I try to hit those places year after year. I'm here in Middle Tennessee myself, so it's not a terribly far drive to get back down to North Georgia and Western North Carolina, where most of my study sites are. And then I'm out in Area X several times a year. I just got back from there. That was the 3rd time I've been there this year, and I have 2 more trips planned. So that's a little bit of a haul, as it's about between 8 and 9 hour drive to get there from here. But so I'm in the field as much as I can be. Obviously, the pandemic has altered things a little bit in terms of like the ease of being able to do that, because there's also been this influx of people into these places, because outdoor recreation is one of the last things that is to some degree unrestricted. And so I have a lot of friends in North Georgia and Western North Carolina. They're like, man, these places that are usually totally empty, they're just overrun with people, out of town vehicles, people coming from like Atlanta and Charlotte and Knoxville and these various cities. And so typically if I'm somewhere, I want to be as remote as possible and as far away from other people as possible, predominantly so that if I do hear some kind of indicative sounds, I can reasonably be sure that they're not being generated by a person or something of that nature. So I do plan to continue with that. I've been pretty busy in the field this year, despite those circumstances, and we'll continue that, throughout the year as time and energy allows, for sure.
Like Matt was saying, you can go to woodape.org, or you can find them on Facebook for more information and to listen to their podcast. And I'm sure your podcast is on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher.
Oh yeah, absolutely. All the major podcatchers, for sure.
All right. Well, I thank you for coming on today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Stay safe out there. We'll see you next time on The Unseen Paranormal. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.